Support for this podcast is brought to you by the Wyoming Humanities. We take a closer look at our human experiences and use stories to explore culture, history, and contemporary issues. You can find us on thinkwhy.org.
I think that there's something really important about being alone as a woman. Being careful and being aware, but also knowing how to be alone.
Hello, I'm Emmy DeGrappa. This is What's Your Why? Each week we bring you stories asking our guests the question why. We learn about their passion, why they do what they do, why should we care, and what can we learn? What better place to explore the human landscape than from the state known for its incredible landscapes, Wyoming? And what better organization than Wyoming Humanities? Serving our state for over 45 years, we share stories, ideas, and wisdom about the human experience. Welcome to What's Your Why? Today, we are talking to Alia Ali. She is a Yemeni-Bosnian-American multimedia artist. Having traveled to 63 countries, lived in 7, and grown up among 5 languages, her most comfortable mode of communication is through image and multisensory mediums. Welcome, Alia.
Thank you so much, Emmy, for having me here. It's a real privilege. Thank you. It's great to be here.
Thank you for being here. My first question is, where did you grow up?
Well, I come from 2 countries that no longer exist. I was born in 1985 in Vienna, Austria. That was just by chance, but actually we were living in North Yemen, in Sana'a. My mother comes from Sarajevo, and my father comes from South Yemen, from Taiz. They actually met on a plane across the aisle. So my brother and I, we grew up in South Yemen. We went to a Yemeni public school because my mother wanted to make sure that we could speak Arabic, but she also wanted us to see the world. So she was a linguist, she was a professor, and whenever she had the chance, she would take us to travel with her to go when she was conducting symposiums or lectures. And so we had the chance to visit places like India, Hong Kong, Pakistan, Istanbul, and of course Sarajevo. So every summer we would go and spend the summer with my maternal side of the family in Sarajevo. But then in 1992, Yugoslavia would divide in what would later be known as one of the worst genocides in Europe, especially after the Holocaust, which had only happened 50 years before. And it was an ethnic cleanse of Muslims. We, at this time, were living in Yemen, which in and of itself was also going through a series of civil wars that were meant to unite these 2 countries and many different tribes. In 1994, we actually experienced and lived through the war there. And during this time, it was quite a significant time because over these years, my father didn't really have appropriate papers because the country didn't exist. My mother didn't really have appropriate papers because that country didn't exist. So we were sort of in this limbo. And as a child, I remember experiencing this by trying to get visas to go to places. Well, we weren't evacuated from there. The war was still going on in Bosnia. Later on, we would come to the United States, and we were naturalized. And we lived in Bloomington, Indiana, and that was wonderful for a while. And then, of course, September 11th hit, and suddenly we felt this sort of alienation, ostracism, and harassment. My family experienced quite a bit of that, actually. But in the following year, I was really fortunate to get I sort of just immersed myself in school, and this is something that I really adore about the United States, which is sort of unlike any other place in the world, where when you say something is merit-based, it's truly merit-based. And I just worked hard. I immersed myself into my language classes, into my art classes, and throughout, growing up, kind of seeing injustices happen, I actually wanted to pursue law. And I got a scholarship to be one of 50 Americans that would go to an international school to sort of represent the United States. And I ended up going to Wales, and I spent 2 years, and I did the International Baccalaureate baccalaureate program, and it was an international setting, and I just thrived in it. And I could speak my mind, I could attend protests, I could get very active in social justice. And because of this school, I also had the opportunity to apply to, obviously at this point, identity was sort of an issue. What am I? Am I American? Am I, now am I Yemeni? Am I Bosnian? But one thing that I was very sure was that I was a woman, and I wanted to go and explore this. And I applied to a college in Massachusetts. It's an all-women's college called Wellesley College. And I got in on full scholarship. And it was an incredible experience. It was there that I initially thought that I would pursue law, but realized that, in fact, one doesn't necessarily gain justice through law. It's more about who's telling the story better. And so I decided to take 2 years off. I moved to Vietnam. I lived there for 2 years and I taught English. But I was also, for a culture that was so far away from anything that I knew or anything that I understood, I was so immersed into it by the arts. I attended exhibitions, I met artists, and I became very close friends with a couple that were documentary filmmakers, one who was American and the other was Tibetan, and they'd found a home in Ho Chi Minh City, in Saigon. And so I decided I still had my scholarship for Wellesley, and I came back and I decided that I wanted to focus on film and possibly documentary film because I wanted to give the same effect about my country, about Yemen, here. The feeling that I got about Vietnam, I wanted to sort of express it here. And so I ended up doing a documentary about Yemen called El Qabila, which means the tribe. And during this time, I realized that everything, even in documentary, you can't really reach a sense of objectivity. In a documentary, in and of itself, it is subjective. Every frame, I had 72 hours of footage, and every frame that was chosen and the order that it was put in and how it was narrated and who was narrating it all became my story. But that was still fictional. It was subjective. It was through my lens. And I stepped away from it to think about how is it possible to raise questions. This is how I fell in love with art and looked at art in a different way. Art raises questions, but it doesn't necessarily promise answers. It promises more questions. Who am I to tell anyone, or my viewer, or who is anyone for that matter, to tell me how I should think, what I should think? But I'm interested in what they're questioning, what they're thinking about. So I took sort of a time, I moved to Morocco and got involved with the arts in Marrakesh and decided that I would fully commit to being an artist in 2014. And my first project was to go to different countries and feed my imagination. So imagination in and of itself is also a language, right? But it's a language that we need to feed. For example, I was speaking to you about your daughter, and so she lives abroad, and she speaks all these languages, and she speaks Spanish all the time. And she was telling you, Mom, I'm just not speaking English anymore. It's hard for me to get that word again. Of course, language, like anything, is something that you need to practice, right? I think in our imagination and to feed our dreams, that's the same thing. We need to feed ourselves more images. We need to travel. We need to read. We need to expose ourselves to artists, to museums, even if it's things that we viscerally disagree with, or that there's something that makes one feel uncomfortable. Sometimes the work that I've been exposed to that makes me feel the most uncomfortable are the ones that have had the most impact, because that's where growth happens. Comfort is something that can also be very dangerous. It doesn't help us grow. And so it's those that makes me kind of look back on myself and say, what is it about that made me so upset? What did it trigger? What did it hit? And I hope that my work will somehow create psychic shifts. So I guess I should explain, my medium is photography. I went from film. How can I do film, which is actually a series of still images put together, if I don't understand how to appreciate the single frame? And so I did a project, as I started to say, that was called I Speak an Image, where I traveled to Tanzania, Kyrgyzstan, Mongolia, Nepal, India, and back to Morocco. And it was a trajectory that was in an infinity sign. It was over 100 days. I traveled by myself, and I traveled on $15 a day. And the goal was that also had to include flights. So the goal was to let go of the fear of being comfortable, of being uncomfortable. I realized before this I had a really great job, and I was afraid of losing it because I was afraid of losing comfort, which was directly connected to money. And so a really wonderful mentor and dear friend said, Alia, if you seek money, happiness may or may not come. But if you seek happiness, money is for certain to come. And so I went to think about what is it that would make me happy. And in fact, what would make me happy is to create dialogue around things that I feel really impassioned about, and to use not only my experiences as a Yemeni and as a Bosnian, but also use my power as an American. The United States has given me my education, who I know as myself as a woman, as an independent woman, but also the opportunity to build bridges, to exist as a mediator across borders. With a blue passport, I can travel, I can experience other cultures, but somehow perhaps I can be an ambassador of peace and not this product of war that I was as a child. So art became a tool, a way of communicating much more universally than through language, because language can also be alienating, right? It can also limit who your viewers are. While I love to read, and in different languages, it sometimes makes me really sad to realize that some of the things that I read aren't translated. And even when they're translated, are they translated correctly? And when you're dealing with things like music or the visual arts, then I think good art makes people move around it. So I work with photography, and I also create intricate framing structures around the photograph where I use textiles and I upholster the space. So the photographs are of objects or people that are entirely covered in fabric. And then the space, there are elements in the space that's either the seating or the entire room or the vase that are covered in the fabric that is actually in the photograph.
And what is your message in those art pieces? Do you want there to be a message? What do you want people to walk away with when they look at one of your art pieces?
Well, we're now definitely in a time, and this is something that I see happens a lot in a country which is built on its diversity in the United States. There's this human need to categorize people. On every form that we fill out, it asks what is your, gender, what is your race, and there's like 5 of them, so you have, I guess, white, Caucasian, Black, African American, Native American, Latina or Latino, Hispanic, and then other, right? And so there's that. And then you have female, male, other. You kind of have to negotiate with these, and what does that even say about a person? And then by religion, ethnicity, you kind of fit into these categorizations. So these also create barriers. And so the fabric in my work actually references duality. It does represent the fabricated barriers in society that essentially we all have in common, that unites us, but in and of itself divides us. So like fabric, okay, let's go. So fabric is something that we're born into. Almost everybody in the world, you're swaddled in fabric. We sleep in it, we wake up in it, we eat on it, we clean with it, we define ourselves by it in terms of fashion, we protect ourselves in the environment with it, and eventually we die in it. And it is something that we all touch almost daily, and yet it physically separates us from each other. It's fascinating. And this is how I also see how some of our categorizations, while they're so beautiful that we see our differences, it can also be something that's used against us. So in everything exists in duality. In order to truly appreciate light, you have to appreciate darkness. I was telling you yesterday, and this is a little digression, but in Morocco, they have these beautiful buildings, these houses that are called riads. And from outside, because you visited Morocco and we were talking about how you were saying that from the outside, it just looks like any other place. They're all sort of, clay houses. But the minute that you come inside, you come into this little corridor and everything is really dark. And when you walk through that corridor, you enter into this beautiful space, open air space. And there's light that's streaming through. There are birds that are chirping. There's always a fountain. And the way that the structure is built is essentially that you cannot appreciate that courtyard. You cannot appreciate that light. You cannot appreciate those sounds had you not, first of all, washed yourself away from all of them. So it's about taking it away and then giving it back and experiencing that in a fresh and a different way. And I think my work, I'd like it to raise questions. So I approach these sort of the different barriers in society that divide us. So, for example, gender, borders, identity. I'm interested in mental spaces of confinement, but also physical spaces of confinement, about inclusion and exclusion. So this is the first series that I worked on, which is called Cast No Evil, where the portraits are auto-portraits. I'm underneath the fabric and I'm photographing myself. And so I never actually see what it is that I'm photographing. And it can be anywhere from 10 photographs to 200 photographs. And I only pick one. So in this, I'm also examining the relationship of me as a photographer, but also as the subject, right? So I'm the person who's the observer and the observed, the victim and the culprit. Aren't we all of those at once? And it would be a lie to say that we are only one side. So how can we embrace both? And only until we embrace both can we actually understand the relationship of them. So the first one, and so it was about inclusion and exclusion, this idea that and about power. Also, as an Arab artist, one of the things that people always talk about is the veil. But what is actually in the veil? And is it only Muslim women that have the veil or that don the veil? Not at all. They're nuns. Okay, there's also in Judaism, in Hasidic traditions that they do that. But then we can go even further and say, what about hunters? When hunters are hunting, don't they want to try to be as anonymous and as disguised as possible? What about avatars? Aren't we all veiled today by our avatars when we go on Facebook? These are these curated ways of how we want people to see us, but we hide behind them in a way. This is how we can there's bullying, there's trolls. We can even see this in history. And one of the works that I talked about, which is a diptych that I did, and I talked about the American bandana. And I wanted to focus on what is the all-American fabric, right? It came down to the bandana. And when I looked at the history of the bandana has its history is fascinating. Some people believe that the paisley came by way of Kashmir, which is on the border of India and Pakistan. Believe that it came by the Scottish. It came to the United States. At the time was not the United States. It was influenced also by Native American designs. Eventually, it becomes this epitome of the Western cowboy. Today, it's also something that defines contemporary gangs, right? So it's an emblem. It's something symbolic. It's something representative. I also looked at something else that has been representative by something in the States, and it was hoods. And so working with black and white bandanas, I created two hoods that were identical. One, as you can see it's a white hood. And if we think about the symbolism and what that represents, it was represented, and it still is, by the KKK, where you've had the masses of members of this group who used it to diffuse the blame. They were hiding behind their anonymity in order to carry out heinous crimes. But it was also that nobody could tell who it was, and it could diffuse the blame because it was everyone. On the other hand, if you take that hood and you make it black, then what comes to me is an image that many people may have forgotten. But in 2004, I believe, it was discovered by some journalists that there was a hidden camp or prison in Iraq called Abu Ghraib. And there was a story that went viral, some photographs that went viral of men who were being tortured. And there was one of the Abu Ghraib prisoner, and he was being held on top of a gasoline container, and attached to him were electric circuits. And on his head was a black hood. And it was told to him, apparently, the form of torture was that if you fall asleep, then you will be electrocuted to death. And so it would be for days that they would be on here. Well, this photograph went viral, and of course it grazed all these protests. But what was interesting to me was how, in one case, the hood was used as a form of power and of anonymity, and the other one was used for confinement. So who is putting it on you? And are you putting it on yourself? It's so much more complex when we're thinking about the colors of things, what type of symbolism that's in the textiles, what it represents, what images come back to our mind. So these are some sort of themes that I work on. The last project that I did, which was quite large, which spanned over 9 months, and it started as a project called People of Pattern. And in 2015 and 2016, it was the lead up to the U.S. elections. During this time, what I realized was that there were a lot of experiences that were kind of coming back to me, a lot of memories that were coming back from 15 years earlier, from September 11th. There were these, hate crimes. There was a lot of xenophobic, but it was much larger. It wasn't just against Arabs and Muslims. It was against everyone. And it was scary. And I felt handicapped. And art, like I mentioned earlier, is sort of the tool in which I work through some of these issues that I think about or that I'm facing. And it had come out that these sort of general terms that Mexicans are rapists, and that's where I just drew the line, because I have a lot of friends that are Mexicans who are hard working. And I looked at my own reflection of Mexico, and I thought, I don't know anything about Mexico. And when I looked on Google and Google Images, I found, there were some maps, and then there was drug cartels and violence and little mice with sombreros. And I thought, this is crazy. What is this? And then there was Cinco de Mayo. And I looked further into it, and as you know, I'm a lover of textiles, and Mexico is probably one of the most advanced. People think about it of India and Japan, which they certainly are, some of the most advanced cultures in textile, but nobody thinks of Mexico, and they are amazing. And so I thought, looking back at my own history, my grandmother in Yemen, she was illiterate. And a lot of our history was written by the British or written by colonizers or invaders or visitors. And those stories were sort of translated and then mistranslated on, but it was never in our own terms, or let's say in the terms of a person who had lived there all their lives, like my grandmother. And she was a real tribeswoman. And so how did she communicate her stories? Well, she communicated it through her dresses and textiles. So she would dye them in the indigo. So it was literally a product of the earth. I mean, you touch it and you touch Yemen. It was, the threads were dyed with the flowers, and there was all of this symbolism that was in there. And we come from a tribe whose emblem is the snake. And the snake is meant to represent power and patience. Well, in the West, the snake is something quite different. It's something conniving. It's something, but for us, it's not. It was something powerful. And also in these textiles, she would embroider things, her surroundings, so the animals, even phenomenon that would happen in the sky. Beautiful, absolutely beautiful. And so to me, this is sort of the most honest testament of how a Yemeni woman, or a Yemeni in all, would talk about their own culture. And I wanted to do the same way about other cultures and through sort of my lens. And so I started in Mexico, in Oaxaca, and I was also hosted by a residency there called Obra Cadobra. And I worked with artisans and with a wonderful man, Remigio Mestas, who had opened me to the different types of textiles, weaving, embroidery, all of which had their own story. And the type of dyes, it has one of the most expensive dyes there, caracol, and there's also cochine. I mean, it's just incredible. Caracol is made from snails, and the snails don't even die. And I'm talking thousands of snails, and it it yields a sort of purple color, which during the colonization, when the Spaniards came, it was actually the color of royalty because it was the most expensive, because it was the hardest to get. So you can clearly see some of these connections, and everything had a story to it. So I photographed these artisans underneath their textiles. And so it was a way of giving a portrait of the culture. It was a documentary on their own terms. After that, I did the same thing, spent 4 to 6 weeks with artisans in Uzbekistan, Indonesia, in Java and in Bali, in Japan, in Kyoto and in Tokyo, in Vietnam, so in Hanoi, Sapa and Tafin region, in Western India, in Kenya, and in Nigeria. And so that can all be seen. And eventually I brought it together to call it Borderland. And why Borderland? Because the topic of borders is not only something that we're talking about in the United States, even though it feels like it's something that's so American. It's something that's happening all over the world. And borders, in effect, are imprints of power, and they're scars of destruction. So even if the borders move or if they disappear, those scars still remain, and they remain a part of the identity of the people. And when we think about the people who live on borderlands, these areas, these regions around the borders, we think about it as a no man's land. Right? It's sort of the trenches. It's sort of everything goes, no one's in charge. But in fact, they're not scary places. Perhaps it's a question that I ask, perhaps that they're territories of exploration, and so when I bring these photographs into a gallery setting and I upholster with some of the fabrics different items inside the room in which people can also touch, and I encourage children to engage with it and touch it, and to also consider, just like textiles, this space is an area of exploration. It's a territory in which we can confront the other, but not necessarily linguistically. When we look at it, to look at the things that we actually have in common, or to see the things that we don't have in common. So, for example, the snake is something that's also very precious in Mexico. And so that created something that was a connection for me and for them, how different symbols are related and translated, how different materials. So the textile, it's defined, it's usually defined by the size of the loom. So whether it's a backstrap loom or that's pretty much how it is. The same thing for paper. You can only print for how large the printer is. But everything inside is this territory of exploration. And so it seemed fitting to apply the paper, which the photographs are printed on, the textile, and also examine it in relation to borders.
That is such an unusual and beautiful explanation, and makes you really think about how what we wear and just the whole feeling of touching a textile, touching fabric, and what that does to you, and whether it's cashmere, and just the feeling that it gives to you, but not really looking at the history of why it makes you feel that way. And I think that is such an unusual and really intricate explanation of how people can look at textiles all around us and really see that there's a world inside of them that we don't even think about on a daily basis.
Absolutely. Oh, absolutely. And I think it's also, in different cultures in the world, I think, in the States, perhaps it's not as much as it, definitely not as much. But I know in Yemen, for example, it was very hard to get ready-made clothes. Okay, so growing up, it was a process to make clothes, but it was a really fun process. So we would there was always a street that had, it was the textile, it was the fabric street. And so you would go, and then you would have the merchants who would open the different types of fabrics, and just sort of, you sit on the ground, and they throw it on the ground, and you're kind of covered by them, and you have tea tea, and it becomes a sort of a social event, and there are other people there who are also looking at it, and then you
It's
take
like a ritual.
It's a total ritual. And then you take that, whatever fabric that you choose, and it's also educational because from a very young age, I could feel something and know, is it brocade? Is it silk? Is it cotton? Is it linen? How to care for it. And then you take that fabric and you think, oh, how much do I need for, a dress or for a skirt or for a jacket? And then you take it to the tailor. And then when you go to the tailor, you have your measurements, or they already have your measurements, because the tailor is like a family member, or the seamstress. I mean, they become very important in your life. And you decide how many pockets you want. Do you want to have a zipper? Do you want to have a button? Do you want to have it on this side or that? So it's a whole creative kind of process. And then you go back home, and then they call you to come in to have a fitting. And then you have the last fitting, and then it's where you're going to wear it. If it's for a specific event, or if it's for the first day of school, or if it's for the big holiday. And that whole process is something that is so special that, in a way, now, although I do have a lot of ready-made clothes, it's something that my mother still does. She does these really incredible jackets that on the outside are very sort of sophisticated and, very sharp. But once you open on the inside, it just has all of these beautiful silks as the lining that she embroiders with gold thread. And they're just unbelievable. And because of that process, I would get remnants, so the tailor would give me all these remnants. And when I came home, I would play with them, because we didn't have things like Barbies, and like the dolls would fall apart in no time. And it didn't really interest me, to be honest. So I had this collection of fabrics of different sizes, and I never cut them up because I knew exactly what would work. And my parents had this really great cassette collection. And my 3 favorite cassettes were Ella Fitzgerald, Tina Turner, and Whitney Houston. So I would get these fabrics and I would somehow become them, and I would tie up different parts of the room, and I would become these incredible women, right? These soulful women. And then I was also in love with National Geographic magazine. And so my parents or friends of my parents would bring it in from outside. And those were also very precious because they weren't available. So I would just look at the photographs over and over until I was ready. And when I was ready and I decided what I would do with them, I would cut them up and put them into collages. But I had to be very careful because every photograph was really precious, because you couldn't go and just pick up another copy of that. And these experiences were some of the most beautiful experiences that I even carry with me today. And how interesting that even these artists, right, made a mark on a young girl in Yemen, hundreds, thousands of miles away, and ended up influencing me in a way, and these kind of textiles ended up influencing me, and it became a way that I decided to negotiate my life and my relationship with the world. That's pretty amazing.
It is amazing. And I would say, as we close, what would be the one piece of advice you would share with a young woman, a young girl, as she's growing up and searching for her identity and her purpose in life? What kind of advice would you give to her?
I think that there's something really important about being alone as a woman, and being careful and being aware, but also knowing how to be alone. And a really wonderful way to do that is to travel. Knowing that you can depend on yourself, knowing that there's a moment in which you really confront yourself, and confront yourself in relationship to things that are very foreign, that are very different, and eventually to realize that those things also somehow become a part of you. So to enrich yourself. And for me, I would say really to be very careful, because a woman traveling alone is not the same thing as a man traveling alone. I mean, when I travel alone, I don't travel at night, and sometimes I can't travel by land. I have to take a plane. I mean, these are just things, these are the reality. But I would say definitely learn how to be alone with yourself and how to never be bored. How to be able to entertain yourself with the places that you go, the things that you read. Your job does not define you. your suffering or your bad experiences, now we're in a time where there's been a lot of this Me Too movement has been quite significant, and it's really incredible for all the brave women and some men who have came out to talk about it. This also, though, many of them did not allow this to define them. Products of war, product of racism, of hatred, these things don't define you. So find the things that do. Be comfortable in yourself and build relationships. But, things around you also can fall apart. Relationships, friendships, sometimes very sadly family. But as long as you know that you are feeding yourself with everything that you can to become a full, productive citizen, then that's would be my advice.
I really like that. Thanks, Alia.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely.
This was such a privilege.
Thank you for talking to me. Thank you for listening. I'm Emmy DeGrappa. This Think Why podcast is brought to you by the Wyoming Humanities. We use the humanities as a lens to explore the human experience. You can find us online at thinkwhy.org.